So inside the studio, I have a pretty interesting drone and payload on this drone. This is the Matrice 300 RTK, and it's paired with the Zenmuse H20N. And that N stands for nighttime. And this camera is amazing in low light situations. Technically, it has 4 different cameras in one. It has 2 thermal cameras, 2 RGB sensors, and a laser rangefinder. And we're gonna be talking about that in this video today. Let's get started. What's good, everybody? Ken here, you're watching OriginaldoBo, and today we're taking a look at the Matrice 300 RTK paired with the Zenmuse H20N. This video is gonna be more about the H20N and less about the Matrice 300. This has been out for a little bit, but this really hasn't, and there's not a lot of information really out there on this. This payload is really designed for search and rescue, first responders, and even law enforcement. It really helps them maximize those precious moments when they matter the most. And with this nighttime sensor, it's called Starlight. It's pretty incredible in these low light situations. So we're gonna do some demonstrations of this, and we'll also have some sample footage in the link in the description where you can download and check it out for yourself. But if you are impatient, you'll find some timestamps for chapters in the description where you can sort of jump around and figure out the information that works best for you. All right, let's just jump into some brief camera specs. I'm not gonna go like too super nitty gritty, but I just wanna explain what each of these different sensors are. So as you're looking at the camera, you'll know what you're looking at. Okay, so on the front of this camera, we do have a laser rangefinder. Now that rangefinder is going to allow you to effectively measure distance from the aircraft to the subject that you are tracking or following. It could even be a piece of wreckage, a person, doesn't matter. It also allows you to lay out pinpoints as you go along. I'll show you how that works when we go to the demonstration portion. To the left of that, we do have a wide angle camera lens, and this wide angle camera lens is probably what I would use the most as I'm just sort of scanning about a field. It's going to be really good for those daytime operations. It does have an effective resolution of 1920 by 1080p with a max frames per second of 30 frames per second. Has an interesting ISO value of 100 to 102,400. And it is a 2 megapixel sensor. So it's not the highest resolution sensor, but again, when you're just scanning, I mean, it's perfectly fine. Now, just to the left of that sensor, we do have a wide angle thermal sensor. Now, this is gonna be great again for scanning those wide open fields. It does have a max resolution of 640 by 512. So it is a pretty solid camera as far as resolution, as far as thermals goes. You still get all the great things that you would expect from a thermal camera. You get your isotherms, your different color palettes, along with radiometric data so you can find different temperatures and pinpoint temperatures in the readings. So you get everything you get on any other thermal sensor. Now this payload also offers a Tele Thermal camera as well that has a 45mm focal length that will provide you up to 8 times digital zoom, which is absolutely incredible for maintaining altitude while you're scaling terrains with different elevations. Unfortunately, Florida doesn't have very many different elevations, but we'll be able to take it to a higher altitude and demonstrate that 8 times digital zoom and show you just how clear the image could be at a higher altitude with a thermal camera. We do have our zoom telephoto lens. This is going to be the sensor that offers that Starlight technology. More about that here in just a moment. But we do have an effective zoom range of 20 times hybrid zoom. So essentially you can zoom in on things from afar. In my experience, this works incredibly well. The images look incredibly detailed. I can read a license plate from an outstanding distance away. It is insane. And when I show you how far you can zoom in on things, it'll absolutely blow your mind. Now, I personally own the H20 and I use that for power line inspections. And basically when we are doing down power lines, we're looking for damage, and I can sit at a rung of lines and just basically sit in one spot and zoom, 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 and use my laser rangefinder to sort of measure the distance from those poles. It works awesome. And yeah, I guess it's a lazy man's way of inspecting power lines, but in down situations, it works perfect. And this zoom lens is absolutely no slouch. All right, as far as max resolution, it maxes out at 2.7K effectively at 30 frames per second. It also offers 1920 by 1080p on the resolution at 30 frames per second as well. So it's not the highest resolution sensor, but that's okay for what it's doing. It also offers 1920 by 1080p at 15 frames per second, which is going to be that night scene mode. You'll see how that operates a little bit later, and there's some things you'll need to understand when you are using this at night, and some things that I didn't realize when I was using that night sensor mode as well. It also has the same ISO range of 100 to 102,400 in video, both in photo. So it's capable of doing quite a lot, just like that wide angle sensor. And then of course that rounds out the specifications on this camera. So as you can see, you have like sort of a Swiss Army knife of cameras on this payload, which really make it unique for different situations. All right, now that we know a lot about the camera, let's go ahead and do some live demonstrations, and I'll do some screen recording with the smart controller so you can sort of see how it operates and sort of the split screen views and why it's helpful to use the split screen with both the RGB night sensor along with the thermal information. Now, I know I said that this is a nighttime oriented payload, but there's actually a lot of great features for the daylight operations on the H20N. Like I said, I do power line inspections when I'm not doing YouTube, and mostly down power lines in emergency situations. But there's a lot to love about this to do other things beyond search and rescue. So I think I'll run you through some of the daytime operations with the Matrice 300 and the H20N, just so you can get an overall feel. We'll also do that license plate test using the H20N's zoom sensor, so we can get a sort of a feel of the overall resolution and zoom quality. All right, let's get this thing up in the air. I'm sure it's gonna attract a lot of attention where I'm at.
Taking off. Full set updated. Check status confirmed.
Let's go ahead and flip over to the zoom. And this is at 4 times. And what we're gonna do is look at these insulators just to see how much detail we can achieve out of this sensor. So the insulators are actually right there on the right-hand side. We're gonna try to zoom into this a little bit more. So let's see if we can zoom. So now we're at 8 times. Let's go a little further. Now we're at 16 times. And you can see
Wind velocity.
It's really not that windy. All right, let's zoom in a little bit more. So that's 30 times, and it's getting a little bit weird with the focus. There it goes. So you can see right here, for me, this is perfect. Like, to be this far away from those lines and to be able to zoom into them and still be able to make out an insulator, and then to just be able to sort of scan and then take my right wheel and just sort of scan left and right helps, because I don't have to actually move the drone. And when you are working in downline situations, really all we're looking for is any damage or any disconnect in these insulators, which as you can see, obviously these are fine, but in a situation where there could be damage, all we are looking for is damage. We don't care about how detailed those shots are. It's just all about whether or not there is actually physical damage. So that's at 30 times optical zoom, or that's actually hybrid zoom, because it's 20 times plus an additional with the digital. So we can go in a little bit further, and this is just crazy at 64 times zoom. And you can see, I mean, I'm able to make out these insulators absolutely perfectly. So for me, this is more than enough. And I know that the megapixels on the H20N zoom sensor is not as impressive as the H20T, but this is absolutely just fine for, like, in those situations where it's an emergency only. This is gonna totally get it done. So let's go ahead and zoom all the way back out, and we'll go back to our wide sensor, and you can see just how far we are at the, we're at 156 foot in altitude, and then we were at 67 feet away from myself here. Now we can also pinpoint that line, so if I wanted to switch over and do a pinpoint, we can do that, and we can pinpoint that, and then we can also measure it. So it's showing that the distance from me to that power line is right at about 1353, so 1,352 feet, and I would say that that's probably pretty accurate.
So let's see, or actually let's do something better. There's a sign over here. Let's see how much text we can actually read. So we're at a pretty safe distance. There's a shopping center here, and let's go ahead and measure that pinpoint to that shopping center. And that's 544 feet. So we'll pull this back to about 600, 700 feet, I would say. So we'll pull it back over to here. And let's go ahead and just zoom in and do a text, sort of a tracking text, or at least see what we can see. So let me flip over to the zoom, and you can see that the text, whoa, obviously anytime you move, that's why it's best to use that scroll wheel. But you can see everything looks super, super sharp. I don't really have any problems reading any of the text. And we're at 600 feet. Yeah, it's over 600 feet to here. Let me just make sure that that is correct. Let me hit the laser rangefinder. I'm sorry, 720 feet. So we're getting good, clear, visible text. Obviously that's a billboard, a little bit easier to see. Let's zoom all the way back out. As you can see, daytime operations still plenty capable for what it is. Let me go ahead and bring this in, and then we'll go ahead and do some nighttime demonstrations, because I'm sure that's what everybody wants to see, is how this thing does at night.
All right, so initially I planned on talking about the H20N in the field, but there was one thing I didn't account for. In the summertime in Florida is the bugs, and anytime you have some sort of illuminated screen in the middle of nowhere where it's pitch black, they are attracted to it incredibly fast. So in order to keep my sanity and not swallow a bunch of bugs trying to talk to a camera in the middle of nowhere, I figured we'd just talk about it here back at the studio. So I've got a lot of footage to sort of go over and talk about, mostly screen captures, screen recordings, because that's really primarily what I'm looking for. When we're using this sensor, I am mostly using the information that I'm seeing off the screen capture. So let's just dive into it and talk about the Starlight sensor, because I think that's what a lot of people are most interested in. Okay, so the first time I got a chance to see the Starlight sensor was with the Sheriff's Department, and we set up a scenario where we had a canine running through a field with a beacon on, and then we had the sheriff in tow following the canine. And I have to say, I'm incredibly impressed with the quality and detail of this particular scene, as it was completely pitch black. And this is not relying on any sort of thermals. This is 15 frames per second, 1080p, and it is doing absolutely amazing in this particular situation. You can make out crazy amounts of detail, and it's actually funny how you can see less when you see the sheriff's light. When he had no light, I'm able to make out all the detail on him. I can see his pants, I can see his belt, I can even see his badge from this image, which I think is pretty crazy. Now there is two more sensors that do equally as well in low light situations on this payload, and that's the Tele Thermal camera and that's the wide angle thermal camera. Both have an amazing use case when it comes to low light or no light situations. And I got a chance to test both of them, and I have to say I'm pretty impressed with what I've seen. So we went out to the power lines where there was really like little to no light. There was pretty much no light. The only light that was being generated was when I flipped on my trail lights from my Jeep. But this is a prime use case situation. If I was doing surveillance, I had, let's say, a farm or something, and I wanted to do surveillance around the perimeter of my farm. This would be a great use case if I found somebody possibly stealing from me. You know, I can basically monitor them at a distance. Now, it's about 300 feet or so away from myself. I think at the max, it was like 295 feet, but in this video, it was like 222 feet in distance. Altitude was about 175 feet. I was trying to keep it as safe, and there is some residential areas out here, so we weren't trying to draw too much attention, although we did a good job of drawing attention to ourselves. But anyways, using the Tele Thermal camera and that 8x zoom, it was incredible the amount of detail that this camera was able to produce. Now, this is a 640 by 512 resolution, and even at a higher altitude and using the digital zoom, we were still able to make out good amounts of detail in our subjects, which I think is pretty important. I can see at one point I am grabbing a box out of the back end of my Jeep, and I can see that the other subject is walking around clutching the side of his hip, which to me would indicate that he's potentially carrying a weapon. So a lot of great detail on these Tele cameras, and the wide camera, which I like the wide camera because it allows me to scan a larger area and just sort of check for subject matter in the scene. Now, when we start talking about the Starlight sensor again, I want to point out this lens flare that you may be seeing. Now, this lens flare isn't actually a flare. What we are seeing is the laser rangefinder being picked up by the IR filter, or lack of IR filtration, on the Tele zoom lens. So the Tele zoom lens, the way they have that CMOS sensor configured, the IR cut filter is a little bit different. So sometimes laser light that we can't physically see with our eyes, can be picked up by a CMOS sensor. And that is exactly what we are seeing here. If you feel like that is too distracting, you can easily turn the laser rangefinder off and on. You can just toggle it on and off. I find that it's more beneficial to keep the laser rangefinder always on so I can measure distance from the aircraft to a subject. I want to pinpoint wreckage. I don't want to have to stop, toggle it back on, toggle it off. Again, we're not making Hollywood movies here. This is a very a utility payload, so I don't care about the image quality, and as long as I can make out details, I can deal with some minor distraction of that flare. But just know, if it does bother you, you can turn the laser rangefinder off and that will go away, no problem. In the thermal sensors, the thermals don't pick that up at all, but again, when you're dealing with an RGB CMOS sensor, it will pick up that lighting, so just wanted to point that out. But you'll see in some instances where I turn on the trail lights of the Jeep, it completely blinds the Starlight sensor, which is crazy because when you think of a camera, you think that it needs lighting, but actually the Starlight sensor does not require any additional ambient lighting to illuminate a scene. It's basically utilizing night vision, which is absolutely crazy. Now, a benefit of using that Starlight sensor is the fact that we can read text on objects and we can make out details a little bit differently. Now, thermal cameras rely on heat signatures to be able to produce an image, but with an RGB image, it's just basically taking exactly what it's seeing and allowing you to see it as well. So if you look closely, you can actually make out some of the graphics on the side of my Jeep. I have graphics, it's a business truck, so there's graphics there. So you can actually make out details on the side of a vehicle, which could be great because if you are doing an operation where you are possibly looking for a suspect or you're doing surveillance on a property, if you have a vehicle, a thermal sensor may not be able to pick up details, and it's certainly not going to be able to see something like a license plate to where you can identify somebody potentially. So that's one of the things that I love about the Starlight sensor, and that's why I think it pairs so well with the other two sensors. So having thermal sensors, having the Starlight sensor allows you to have the best of both worlds, and scaling different elevations, the thermal sensors tend to help a little bit better. And then when you need to make out details on a subject, that is where the Starlight sensor sort of fills in those gaps where typical RGB sensors would not be able to do. So that is the H20N low light situation. It's absolutely mind-boggling. There is a little bit of a workflow to understand when you start using this. One of the things to keep in mind, because the H20N does produce at 15 frames per second, 1080p, you want to sort of make sure that the unit is perched. And when I mean by perched, you want to be having it like sort of stationary, essentially. You don't want to be making any sudden movements. If you are going to be scaling or moving or changing locations, that's where that Tele zoom sensor, I think, would serve you best to scan your terrain and make sure that there's no changes in elevation. Obviously here in Florida, it's pretty much the flattest state besides Kansas. So I don't really have to worry too much about things changing, but like, as you can see when we were by those power lines, well, you know, I want to be able to see those lines and know where I have clearance, and that's what it was able to do. Now, I also did one more test where I wanted to see if I could make out a weapon with the H20N. So I had my friend draw his pistol from his side to see if we can make it out. And if you're looking closely, whether you're looking at the Starlight sensor or you're looking at the thermal data that we've achieved, you can make out that he is holding something in his hands, which is useful for law enforcement as they are gauging a situation, determining the risk factor before they send somebody in there to make contact with somebody. It's honestly, it's invaluable information. And while it's hard to see, and like we may look at it and not see something, it's like looking at a sonogram. and you're trying to determine a sex of the baby. I don't know what I'm looking at, but the person doing the sonogram, they're like, yeah, it's a boy, it's a girl. I have no idea what I'm looking at, but a law enforcement officer is gonna look at that and they're gonna say, yep, that's a gun, that's a gun. And they're gonna know whether or not that risk factor has been enhanced. So that's the capabilities of the H20N. And in low light, it's pretty damn impressive. And I would say it's pretty much top notch as far as search and rescue goes and nighttime operations. Alrighty, so I know that was a lot of information to unpack, but I gotta say, I'm honestly impressed with this sensor. I'm honestly impressed with the capabilities of the Matrice, and it just keeps getting better as they produce more and more cameras for this unit. It's honestly the Swiss Army knife of drones, if you ask me. Anyways, if you want to know more about this sensor, I'll leave some links in the description below where you can read more about the more nitty-gritty detail specs. For me, I'm more about the show and tell aspect, not so much about the on-paper specs, because specs are one thing, but actually seeing it in action and seeing the people that need to use a camera like this use it live, to me is more valuable than anything else. All right, that's gonna do it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I know this was a really different video. If you did, be sure to smash that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next video. Stay original.